My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I live in a small farmhouse just outside Clarksville, Tennessee, where the rolling hills meet endless skies, and the nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile down a dirt road. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 years, I stood before the cracked mirror in our tiny bathroom and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The reflection showed hollow eyes rimmed with dark circles, skin pale as winter frost, and hair that I hadn't properly brushed in days. My clothes hung loose on my shrinking frame, and my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the chipped porcelain sink. I used to be someone else entirely. A young woman with dreams as vast as the Tennessee sky. Someone who believed that love could conquer anything, that faith could move mountains, that being a mother would be the greatest blessing of my life. That woman felt like a stranger now. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. I am the mother of 7 children. 7. Each name is carved into my heart. Emma, age 12, with her father's stubborn chin and my grandmother's green eyes. The twins, Jacob and Joshua, 10 years old and identical in everything except Jacob's crooked smile. Little Mary, 8, who still believes in fairy tales. Samuel, 6, with dirt permanently under his fingernails. Rebecca, 4, who asks why about everything. And baby David, barely 2, who clings to my leg like I'm the only steady thing in his world. 7 souls that depend on me for everything. 7 futures resting in my exhausted hands. 7 reasons to keep breathing, even when breathing feels like drowning. The old farmhouse we call home creaks and settles around us like a ship weathering an endless storm. The roof leaks when it rains hard, sending us scrambling for pots and buckets. The heating system works when it wants to, which means we huddle together on cold November nights like the one outside my window now. The wallpaper, faded and peeling, tells the story of better days when this house knew laughter instead of tears, abundance instead of want. My husband, Michael, had been a good man once. I could still remember him in the early days, when his laughter filled rooms and his hands were gentle on my face. But somewhere between baby number 4 and baby number 7, between lost jobs and mounting bills, between sleepless nights and endless worry, that man had disappeared. In his place stood a ghost who came home late smelling of whiskey and disappointment, who looked at his children like they were chains around his ankles instead of gifts from heaven. 3 months ago, he stopped coming home altogether. The silence that followed his leaving was almost worse than the arguments that had filled our nights. At least when he was here, there was another adult in the house, even if that adult had become more burden than blessing. Now there was just me, standing in this cracked mirror, trying to find the strength to face another day that would demand everything I had and more. Outside, I could hear the sounds of morning beginning. Emma was already up, bless her heart, trying to help get the younger ones ready for school. Her voice drifted through the thin walls as she coaxed Samuel into his clothes and convinced Rebecca to eat her cereal instead of playing with it. At 12, she carried burdens that should have been mine, and the guilt of that knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. The smell of instant coffee mixed with the mustiness of our old house created an atmosphere that had become as familiar as breathing. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it momentarily clearing the fog in my mind. The water was rusty from our old pipes, leaving metallic traces on my lips that reminded me of blood or tears. I pressed my palms against the mirror, watching my reflection fragment around my fingers. 7 children, 1 broken mother, 1 absent father, bills that grew like weeds in summer, choking out any hope of getting ahead. A depression that had crept in so slowly I hadn't noticed it taking root until it bloomed into this suffocating darkness that followed me everywhere. The truth was, I had stopped praying months ago. Oh, I still went through the motions on Sundays when we could afford gas for the car and everyone had clean clothes to wear. I still bowed my head at mealtimes and whispered the familiar words. But real prayer, the kind that comes from a heart, that believes someone is listening, that had died somewhere between Michael's last empty promise and the day I realized that hoping for help that never came was more painful than not hoping at all. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my unwashed hair, and practiced the smile I would wear for my children. It was a mask I had perfected over months of pretending, a lie that protected them from the depth of my despair. They needed their mother to be strong, even if that strength was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The sounds from the kitchen grew louder. Rebecca's giggle, Joshua's complaint about his shoes, baby David's babbling as he banged his spoon against his high chair. My children, my 7 reasons for existing, were waiting for me to begin another day I wasn't sure I had the strength to face. But I would face it, because that's what mothers do. We carry burdens that would break other people's backs. We smile when we want to scream. We give when we have nothing left to give. We love when love feels impossible. I took one last look at the stranger in the mirror, whispered a prayer I wasn't sure anyone was listening to, and opened the bathroom door to begin another day of pretending to be whole. The kitchen was chaos, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Emma stood at the stove, her young face serious with concentration as she flipped pancakes that were more burn than batter. The twins argued over who got the last clean bowl, while Mary sat at our scarred wooden table, methodically arranging her food by color instead of eating it. Samuel had managed to get syrup in his hair somehow, and Rebecca was trying to feed her. Breakfast to the cat we couldn't afford to keep, but couldn't bear to abandon. Baby David, strapped into a high chair that had seen 6 children before him, smiled at me with such pure joy that my heart cracked a little. His face was sticky with whatever Emma had managed to get into him, his dark hair sticking up in impossible directions. When he saw me, he reached out with both chubby arms, making that demanding noise that meant, "Mama, pick me up. Love me, make everything better." "Morning, Mama," Emma said without turning around, but I could hear the strain in her young voice. She shouldn't have to worry about breakfast for 6 other people. She should be thinking about friends and school projects and which boy might like her, not whether we had enough milk to last the week. "Thank you, sweetheart," I managed, my voice coming out rougher than intended. I lifted David from his chair, and he immediately buried his sticky face in my neck, his small body warm against mine. For a moment, the weight of him was exactly what I needed. Proof that love still existed in this broken world, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. The kitchen smelled like burnt pancakes and coffee that had been brewing too long, mixed with the sour scent of David's morning diaper and the lingering mustiness that permeated every corner of our house. The linoleum floor, cracked and yellowed with age, was sticky under my bare feet. Our refrigerator hummed and rattled, held, together with duct tape and prayer, its contents sparse enough that every meal was an exercise in creative stretching. "Mama, Joshua took my backpack." Jacob's voice cut through the morning noise, high with indignation. "I did not. Yours is the blue one, stupid." "Don't call your brother stupid," I said automatically, the words worn smooth by repetition. "And Joshua, help your brother find his backpack instead of arguing about it." Samuel appeared at my elbow, syrup still glistening in his sandy hair. "Mama, I can't find my other shoe." "Did you look under your bed?" I looked everywhere. Look again. The morning routine was a dance I could perform in my sleep, and some days I wondered if I actually was sleeping through it all. Feed the baby, find lost shoes, mediate fights, check backpacks, make sure everyone had lunch money. Or in our case, the brown bag lunches that stretched our grocery budget but still left them hungry by afternoon. Kiss foreheads, send them off into a world that I prayed would be kinder to them than it had been to me. But this morning felt different, heavier. As I moved through the familiar motions, I felt like I was underwater, everything muffled and distant. David's weight in my arms felt like an anchor, and not the good kind that keeps you steady, but the kind that drags you down into dark depths where breathing becomes impossible. Emma handed Mary a plate of the least burnt pancakes, her movements efficient and careful. "There's enough for everyone if we all just take 2, she announced with the authority of someone who had learned to manage scarcity before she learned algebra. 2 pancakes each. When had that become abundance in our house? I watched my children navigate their morning with a resilience that should have made me proud, but instead filled me with shame. They had adapted to our new normal, with the flexibility that children possess, making games out of hardship, finding joy in small things that adults would consider inadequate. They deserved so much more than 2 pancakes each, and a mother who had to practice smiling in mirrors. The school bus would come in 20 minutes, and the morning rush would begin. Coats that were too small from last winter but would have to do. Lunch bags with more love than food inside. Kisses and hugs and promises that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed those promises anymore. Rebecca tugged at my pajama pants, her 4-year-old face serious. "Mama, are you sad again?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I knelt down to her level, David still in my arms, and looked into her eyes that were so much like my own used to be. Clear and trusting, and full of belief that mamas could fix anything. "Why do you ask that, baby?" "Because you look like when Daddy used to look, before he went away." Out of the mouths of babes. I pulled her close with my free arm, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo that we'd bought on sale 3 months ago, and rationed like liquid gold. "Mama's just tired, sweetheart. That's all." But it wasn't all, and somewhere deep inside, Rebecca knew it. They all knew it. Children have radar for their parents' pain, even when we think we're hiding it perfectly. They absorb our stress like little sponges, carrying burdens they shouldn't have to understand. The weight of 7 hearts depending on mine felt crushing in that moment. 7 futures that could be shaped by my failures. 7 souls who deserved a mother who could give them more than empty smiles and stretched resources. 7 reasons to be strong when strength felt impossible. As I stood there in our broken-down kitchen, holding my baby and my daughter, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of my imperfect family, something inside me began to crack. Not the kind of crack that breaks things beyond repair, but the kind that lets light in, or maybe lets darkness out. I wasn't sure which yet, but change was coming. I could feel it in my bones like a storm approaching, inevitable and terrifying, and maybe, just maybe, necessary. The school bus honked outside, and the morning rush began in earnest. But as I helped gather backpacks and signed permission slips and kissed goodbye cheeks, I carried with me Rebecca's innocent question and the weight of my own growing awareness that something had to give. I just hoped that when it did, we would all survive the breaking. After the school bus rumbled away down our gravel driveway, taking 5 of my 7 children with it, the house fell into an uneasy quiet. David played in his playpen with toys that had been loved by 6 siblings before him, their paint worn smooth by countless small hands. Rebecca curled up on the couch with a picture book, her finger tracing words she was just beginning to recognize. This was supposed to be my peaceful time. 3 hours before the bus brought everyone home again. 3 hours when the demands were manageable, when I could catch my breath and maybe, if I was lucky, find a moment for myself. Instead, I felt like I was drowning in the silence. The depression had been my constant companion for so long now that I sometimes forgot what it felt like to wake up without that heavy blanket of exhaustion settling over me before my feet hit the floor. It wasn't just sadness, though there was plenty of that. It was a bone-deep weariness that made simple tasks feel like climbing mountains, It was the voice in my head that whispered cruel truths about my failures as a mother, as a wife, as a human being who couldn't manage to keep her family together. I moved through the house like a ghost, picking up toys and folding laundry and wiping surfaces that would be dirty again within hours. The motions were automatic, muscle memory of maternal duty, but I felt disconnected from them, like I was watching someone else live my life. The house around me told the story of our decline in ways that broke my heart daily. The carpet in the living room had a stain from when Joshua spilled grape juice 2 months ago, and no amount of scrubbing could make it disappear completely. The walls needed paint, but paint was a luxury we couldn't afford when choosing between that and groceries was an easy decision. Family photos hung crooked in frames that had been cheap to begin with, and now looked shabby, chronicling happier times that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, and I found myself staring at it with a mixture of longing and dread. There was a time when that phone would ring throughout the day, friends checking in, family calling just to chat, Michael calling from work to say he loved me. Now it rarely rang at all, and when it did, it was usually someone looking for money we didn't have or services we couldn't afford. I had become invisible somehow, not just to the world but to myself. When had I last looked in a mirror and seen Sarah instead of just the mother? When had I last thought about my own dreams, my own needs, my own identity separate from the 7 small people who defined every moment of my existence? Rebecca looked up from her book. "Mama, will you read with me?" I settled beside her on the couch, its cushions worn and sagging from years of family life. She snuggled against my side, warm and trusting, and opened her book to a story about a little rabbit who was afraid of the dark. As I read the familiar words, my voice steady and soothing for her benefit, I wondered if I was like that rabbit, terrified of shadows that might not even be real. But my shadows were real. The pile of unopened bills on the kitchen table was real. The silence from my husband was real. The emptiness in my chest where hope used to live was as real as the child in my arms. David began to fuss, and I lifted him from the playpen, automatically checking his diaper and offering him a bottle. His needs were simple and immediate: food, warmth, comfort, love. I could provide 3 out of 4 with reliability, but love felt complicated when everything else was so hard. I loved my children fiercely, desperately, with every fiber of my being. But sometimes love felt like drowning, like being pulled under by the very people you would die to protect. Sometimes love was exhausting and thankless, and not nearly enough to solve the problems that kept multiplying like weeds in our garden. The laundry basket sat overflowing in the corner, a constant reminder that the work was never done. Clothes that had been washed and re-washed until the fabric was thin, hand-me-downs from generous neighbors who tried to help without making us feel like charity cases. I pulled out a tiny shirt that had been worn by all 7 children, its original. Color faded to something indefinable, and felt the weight of history in its worn fibers. This shirt had been new once, bought with excitement for Emma when she was David's age. Now it was ending its journey through our family, threadbare but still functional, like everything else in our lives. The mailman's truck rumbled up the driveway, and I felt my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. More bills, maybe an overdue notice, possibly something official-looking that would require attention I didn't have the energy to give. I waited until he drove away before checking the box, postponing the moment when I would have to face whatever new crisis might be waiting. Inside were 3 bills, 2 pieces of junk mail, and a card addressed to the Mitchell family in handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it first, partly from curiosity and partly from desperate hope that it might contain some unexpected good news. It was a card from our church, signed by the pastor and his wife. "We've been thinking of you and the children," it read. "Please know that you're in our prayers, and if there's anything we can do to help, don't hesitate to ask." The kindness of it should have warmed me, but instead, it made me feel smaller somehow. Even people who barely knew us could see that we were drowning. Our need was so obvious that it prompted sympathy from near strangers. What did that say about how far we had fallen? I set the card on the counter next to the bills I couldn't bring myself to open yet, and returned to the couch where Rebecca was still working through her book. David had fallen asleep in my arms, his small body heavy and warm, his breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to have that kind of peace, that trusting sleep that came from knowing someone else was handling all the worries. But I was the someone else. I was the one who was supposed to have everything handled, who was supposed to make everything work, who was supposed to be strong enough for all of us, and I was failing spectacularly at all of it. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a desert, vast and empty and difficult to cross. In a few hours, the bus would return with homework questions and hungry bellies and the beautiful chaos that defined our evenings. I would put on my mask again, smile and laugh, and pretend that everything was fine, because that's what mothers do. But sitting there in the quiet house, holding my sleeping baby, while my daughter learned to read beside me, I felt the weight of my own invisible pain settling deeper into my bones. I was disappearing, becoming nothing more than the sum of other people's needs. And I wasn't sure there was enough left of me to survive much more of this gradual erasure. The shadows in the room were growing longer as the afternoon sun slanted through our dirty windows, and I closed my eyes, wishing I could disappear into those shadows completely, just for a little while, just long enough to remember who I used to be before I became the woman who practiced smiles in broken mirrors. That night, after the last dish was washed and the last child tucked into bed, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the bills I could no longer avoid. The overhead light flickered, another thing that needed fixing in a house full of things that needed fixing, casting unstable shadows across the papers that documented our financial ruin. Past due. Final notice. Service will be discontinued. The words blurred together through tears I was too tired to fight anymore. The electric company wanted $300 by Friday, or they would shut off our power. The phone company had already sent 2 warnings. The mortgage payment was 47 days late, and the letter from the bank used words like foreclosure and legal action. I spread the bills across the table like cards in a losing poker hand and tried to do math that wouldn't work no matter how many times I rearranged the numbers. Michael's child support checks had stopped coming 6 weeks ago, along with any other communication from the man who had once promised to love me through better and worse. We were living in worse, and I was living it alone. The house creaked. Around me, old wood settling into the November cold. Upstairs, I could hear Rebecca coughing. The same cough she'd had for 2 weeks that I couldn't afford to take to the doctor unless it got much worse. Samuel's shoes had holes in them, but new shoes would have to wait. Emma needed supplies for a school project, but I had learned to be creative with excuses for why those supplies never materialized. My children were paying the price for my inability to hold our life together, and the guilt of that knowledge sat in my chest like broken glass, sharp and cutting with every breath. I pushed the bills away and put my head in my hands, feeling the familiar weight of hopelessness settling over me like a heavy blanket. This was the time of day when the depression hit hardest, when the children were asleep and I had nowhere to hide from the reality of our situation. During the day, I could lose myself in their needs, in the immediate tasks of mothering. But at night, in the quiet darkness, I had to face the truth that I was failing them in ways that love alone couldn't fix. The silence was broken by a sound from upstairs, David crying, his voice thin and distressed in the darkness. I climbed the stairs on legs that felt like lead, my body protesting every step. His room was cold. The heating system was struggling again, another expense we couldn't afford to address properly. He stood in his crib, reaching for me through the bars, his face red and tear-streaked. When I lifted him, he was burning with fever, his small body radiating heat, that sent panic shooting through me. This was more than his usual fussiness. This was real sickness, the kind that required medical attention I couldn't afford. I held him against my chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat against mine, and the weight of everything. The bills, the loneliness, the constant struggle, the fear, the bone-deep exhaustion of trying to be everything to everyone while slowly disappearing myself, crashed over me like a wave that finally knocked me down. I sank into the old rocking chair beside his crib, the same chair where I had nursed all 7 of my babies, where I had sung lullabies and made promises about the future that I was proving unable to keep. David's fever-warm body shook with silent sobs, and my own tears fell into his dark hair as I rocked him in the darkness. "I don't know what to do anymore," I whispered into the quiet room. "I don't know how to fix any of this." The words hung in the air like a prayer or a confession, and I wasn't sure which. Maybe they were both. For months, I had been holding everything together through sheer will and stubbornness, refusing to admit that I was drowning. But sitting there in the dark with my sick baby in my arms and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on me, I finally faced the truth I had been avoiding. I was broken. Completely, utterly broken. And I didn't have enough pieces left to put myself back together again. David's breathing was labored, each small inhale a reminder of another decision I couldn't afford to make wrong. Take him to the emergency room and face bills that would destroy us financially, or wait and hope it wasn't serious and risk something happening to him. Either choice felt like a betrayal of my responsibilities as a mother. The rocking chair creaked beneath us, a sound that had once been comforting but now felt ominous, like the groaning of a ship taking on water. Through the window, I could see the stars scattered across the Tennessee sky, distant and cold and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out below. I had always believed in prayer, had been raised to trust that God was listening, that faith could move mountains. But sitting there in the darkness with my fevering baby and my impossible bills and my crushing loneliness, prayer felt like shouting into an empty canyon, waiting for an echo that never came. Still, what else was left? "Jesus," I whispered, the name feeling strange on my lips after so many months of silence between us. "If you're there, if you're listening, I can't do this anymore. I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. I'm failing everyone I love, and I don't know how to stop failing." My voice cracked on the words, and David stirred against me, his fever-bright eyes opening to look at me with the trust that children have, the absolute faith that Mama can fix anything. But Mama couldn't fix anything. Mama couldn't even fix herself. "I used to believe you had a plan," I continued, my voice barely audible in the darkness. "I used to think that if I just tried hard enough, loved deeply enough, prayed faithfully enough, everything would work out. But I don't know how to believe that anymore. I don't know how to hope when hope keeps leading to disappointment." The tears came harder then, months of stored grief pouring out in the darkness. I cried for the marriage that had died slowly, for the dreams that had been sacrificed on the altar of survival, for the children who deserved so much more than I could give them. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who had looked at her reflection and seen someone worthy of love, instead of someone barely holding on. David's fever seemed to be breaking, his breathing becoming easier, but I continued to hold him, close, drawing comfort from his warm weight, even as my heart felt like it was shattering in my chest. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and whistling through the gaps in our old house, reminding me of all the repairs we couldn't afford, all the ways our shelter was failing to protect us from the storms. In that moment, holding my sick child in the darkness of our falling down house with bills I couldn't pay scattered across my kitchen table, I hit the bottom I had been falling toward for months. There was nowhere left to go but up, but I couldn't see any way to climb out of the hole I had fallen into. All I had left was the whispered prayer in the darkness, the desperate hope that someone was listening even when silence was the only answer I seemed to get. All I had left was the love for my children that burned in my chest like a flame that refused to be extinguished, no matter how dark everything else became. It would have to be enough, because it was all I had left to give. David's fever, finally, broke around 3 a.m, his small body relaxing into peaceful sleep against my chest. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt hollowed out, scraped raw by the emotional storm that had passed through me. I tucked him gently back into his crib, pulling his blanket up to his chin, and watched his chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. The house was tomb quiet around me as I made my way back to my own bedroom, every step on the old wooden floors sounding like thunder in the silence. I paused at each child's door, listening for the sounds that would tell me they were safe, that they were breathing, that they would make it through another night in this imperfect life I had given them. Emma slept with her arm flung over her pillow, her young face peaceful in a way that made my heart ache. She looked so much like I had at her age, full of possibilities and dreams that hadn't been worn down by reality yet. The twins were tangled together in their shared bed, Joshua's leg thrown over Jacob's back in unconscious brotherhood. Mary had kicked off her covers and lay sprawled like a starfish, completely vulnerable in her trust that morning would come, and bring with it all the things that made her world safe. Samuel slept clutching a stuffed bear that had belonged to his father as a child, one of the few things Michael had left behind besides empty beer bottles and unpaid bills. Rebecca's thumb had found its way to her mouth in sleep, a habit she had broken during the day, but returned to in her dreams when comfort was needed. My children, my 7 reasons for breathing, my 7 sources of joy and terror and overwhelming love that sometimes felt too big for my body to contain. Looking at them sleeping so peacefully, so trusting that tomorrow would take care of itself, I felt the weight of my failures crushing down on me again. I closed my bedroom door behind me and stood in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the light. The room felt too big and too small at the same time, full of memories of the marriage that had died here, the dreams that had been born and buried between these walls. The bed looked enormous without Michael in it, a reminder of how alone I had become in the space that should have been filled with partnership and love. I sank down onto the edge of the mattress, my legs finally giving out from the exhaustion that had been building for months. The depression settled over me like a familiar coat, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around me until I could barely breathe. This was when it was worst. In the dark, quiet hours when there was nowhere to hide from the voice in my head that cataloged all my failures, all my inadequacies, all the ways I was letting down the people who depended on me most. The tears came, again, but quietly this time, sliding down my cheeks like the remnants of a storm that had passed through and left only destruction in its wake. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, making myself as small as possible, as if I could shrink small enough to disappear entirely. Maybe that would be better for everyone. Maybe my children would be happier with someone who could actually take care of them. Someone who didn't cry herself to sleep every night and practice smiles in mirrors. Maybe they would be better off in foster care, or with relatives, or anywhere that wasn't with a mother who couldn't even keep the lights on or put decent food on the table. The thought should have horrified me, but instead, it felt almost like relief. To not have to pretend anymore. To not have to be strong when strength felt impossible. To not have to watch my children pay the price for my inability to hold our life together. I can't do this anymore, I whispered into the darkness, my voice broken and raw. I can't be what they need. I can't fix what's broken. I just can't. The words hung in the air like a surrender, and maybe that's what they were. After months of fighting and struggling and pretending, I was finally admitting defeat. I was finally acknowledging that I wasn't strong enough, good enough, capable enough to be the mother my children deserved. I lay down on the bed fully clothed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters, except the monsters were real and they lived inside my own mind. The darkness was complete under the blanket, and I let myself dissolve into it, feeling like I was disappearing from the inside out. That's when it happened. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the kind of hallucination that comes from exhaustion and emotional overload. The darkness under the covers began to change, not growing lighter exactly, but somehow less oppressive, less empty, as if something was filling the space that had been hollow and cold. I felt them before I saw them. Hands, gentle and warm, touching my face with a tenderness that I had forgotten existed in the world. Not Michael's hands, which had become rough and calloused and increasingly absent. Not my children's hands, which were small and needy and constantly reaching for things I couldn't give them. These hands were different, carrying a kind of peace that I hadn't felt since never. I opened my eyes, and the darkness wasn't dark anymore. There was light, but not from any lamp or window. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, soft and golden and alive in a way that electric light never was. And in that light, kneeling beside my bed, as if he had been waiting there all along, was Jesus. I should have been frightened. I should have questioned my sanity. I should have done any number of rational things that rational people do when faced with the impossible. Instead, I felt a peace so deep, it seemed to reach into the broken places inside me and begin the slow work of healing. He didn't speak, not with words that my ears could hear anyway. But his presence filled the room with a communication that went deeper than language, and I understood with perfect clarity that he had been there all along, through every sleepless night and every whispered prayer and every moment when I had felt completely alone. His hands continued to move across my face, wiping away tears that I hadn't realized were still falling. But with each tear he dried, something else was being cleaned away too. The shame, the sense of abandonment, the crushing weight of trying to carry everything by myself. Each gentle touch was removing a layer of the pain that had built up around my heart like scar tissue. I found myself crying harder then, but it was different from the desperate tears of despair I had been shedding. These tears felt like release, like a dam finally breaking and allowing all the trapped water to flow free. Years of held-back grief poured out of me, for my marriage, for my struggles, for the dreams I had given up, for the woman I had been, before life wore her down to nothing. And with each sob, I felt lighter. Not because my problems had disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying them alone. The presence beside my bed was absorbing the weight of my burdens, taking on the load that had been crushing me, offering to share the responsibilities that had been breaking my back. Time seemed suspended in that golden light. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The broken mother and the savior who had come to her bedside. But gradually the tears slowed and my breathing steadied, and a warmth began to spread through my chest where cold emptiness had lived for so long. When the light finally began to fade and the presence beside my bed grew less tangible, I wasn't afraid. I was changed. Not magically healed or instantly fixed, but fundamentally different in a way that I knew would last. The depression was still there. The bills were still on my kitchen table. My children still needed things I couldn't provide. But I was no longer alone in facing those challenges. As the room returned to ordinary darkness, I whispered, "Thank you," into the quiet air and meant it with every fiber of my being. For the first time in months, I closed my eyes and slept without crying, without fear, without the crushing weight of despair pressing down on my chest. Morning would come, and with it all the same problems I had faced the night before. But I would face them differently now, knowing that invisible hands were ready to help carry the load. That a presence walked beside me even when I couldn't see him. That love existed in the world that was stronger than my failures, and deeper than my pain. The miracle wasn't that my problems disappeared. The miracle was that I was no longer alone with them. I woke before dawn, with a lightness in my chest that I had almost forgotten was possible. The morning air was crisp and clean through our cracked window, and instead of the familiar dread that usually greeted me upon waking, I felt something I hardly dared to name: hope. The encounter in the darkness hadn't been a dream. I knew this with the same certainty that I knew my own name, knew the faces of my children, knew the sound of my mother's voice. Something fundamental had shifted inside me during those precious moments, when heaven had touched earth in my broken-down bedroom. The depression hadn't vanished like morning mist. I could still feel its presence lurking at the edges of my consciousness, but it no longer had the power to define every breath I took. I slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the bathroom, where the same cracked mirror waited for me. But this time, when I looked at my reflection, I saw something different. The hollow eyes were still there, the tired lines around my mouth, the tangled hair that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But underneath it all, there was a spark that hadn't been there yesterday, a glimmer of the woman I used to be fighting her way back to the surface. "Good morning," I whispered to my reflection, and for the first time in months, I meant it. The sounds of morning began to filter through the house. David babbling in his crib, Emma's alarm clock buzzing, the familiar symphony of a large family waking up to face another day. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the approaching chaos, I felt energized by it. These sounds weren't demands being made on my depleted resources. They were reminders of the abundance of love that filled our shabby little house. When I lifted David from his crib, his fever completely gone, his dark eyes bright and alert, he smiled at me with such pure joy that I laughed out loud. When was the last time I had laughed? Really laughed. Not the forced laughter I performed for my children's benefit, but the kind that bubbled up from somewhere deep and genuine inside me. "Good morning, baby boy," I said, nuzzling his soft neck until he giggled. "Mama feels better today. Do you know why? Because we're not alone anymore. We're going to be okay." And as I said the words, I believed them. Not because our circumstances had changed. The bills were still sitting on the kitchen table. The house was still falling apart around us. Michael was still absent from our lives. But because my perspective had shifted in a way that made all the difference. Emma was already in the kitchen when I arrived with David on my hip, her young face serious with concentration, as she attempted to make breakfast for her younger siblings. Instead of feeling guilt at her premature responsibility, I felt gratitude for her generous heart and determination to help. "Thank you for taking such good care of everyone, sweetheart," I said, setting David in his high chair and moving to stand beside her at the stove. "But let me help you with that. We're a team, remember?" She looked up at me with surprise, and I realized with a pang how long it had been since I had offered to help, instead of just accepting her help as my due. The depression had made me selfish in ways I was only beginning to recognize, so focused on my own pain that I had forgotten to nurture the relationships that mattered most. Together, we made breakfast that was still simple: scrambled eggs, and toast that was only slightly burnt, but the process felt different. Instead of going through the motions in a fog of exhaustion, I was present for it, aware of Emma's quiet pride in her cooking skills, conscious of the way baby David banged, his spoon against his tray in rhythm with some internal song only he could hear. The twins thundered down the stairs, Samuel close behind, all of them bringing the beautiful chaos that I had learned to associate with survival mode. But this morning, the chaos felt manageable, even joyful. These weren't burdens I had to carry. They were gifts I had been trusted with, small miracles walking around in dirty socks and mismatched clothes. "Mama, you look different," Rebecca observed with the startling perception that 4-year-olds sometimes possess. She tilted her head to one side, studying my face with serious brown eyes. "You look like sunshine." do I? I knelt down to her level, smoothing her wild morning hair. That's because I remembered something important last night. Do you want to know what it is? She nodded solemnly. I remembered that even when things are hard, even when we don't have everything we want, we have everything we need as long as we have each other, and we have someone watching over us who loves us very much. Jesus? She asked, and the simple faith in her voice made my heart skip. Yes, baby, Jesus. The morning routine proceeded with its usual challenges: lost shoes, forgotten homework, arguments over who got to sit where on the bus. But I navigated it all with a patience that surprised me. When Samuel couldn't find his backpack, I helped him look for it instead of snapping at him to be more responsible. When the twins started pushing each other over some imagined slight, I mediated their conflict with gentleness instead of exasperation. Most remarkably, when the pile of bills caught my eye from the kitchen table, I didn't feel the familiar surge of panic. The problems were still real. The numbers still didn't add up. The consequences were still looming. But I was no longer facing them alone, and that made all the difference. After the school bus pulled away and the house settled into its daytime quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with David playing contentedly at my feet and Rebecca coloring beside me. Instead of avoiding the bills, I spread them out deliberately and began to make a plan. It wasn't a magical plan. I still didn't have money that hadn't existed the day before. But it was a plan born of hope instead of despair, creativity instead of defeat. I would call the electric company and arrange a payment plan. I would contact the church that had sent the sympathy card and ask about their assistance program. I would swallow my pride and reach out to my sister, who had offered help months ago that I had been too ashamed to accept. Most importantly, I would stop trying to carry everything by myself. The phone felt lighter in my hand as I made the first call. And when the customer service representative at the electric company offered me options I hadn't known existed, I felt the first stirring of what I dared to call optimism. One by one, I worked through the stack of problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. Not all of the conversations were encouraging, but none of them were the disasters I had imagined in my anxious mind. People were willing to work with me, to extend deadlines, to offer payment plans and assistance programs. As the morning progressed, I found myself humming while I worked. Actual humming, not the desperate distraction techniques I had been using to keep the dark thoughts at bay. David looked up at me with delight when he heard the sound, clapping his hands as if I were performing just for him. "You like Mama's singing, don't you?" I asked, scooping him up for a spontaneous dance around the kitchen. Rebecca giggled and joined in, and for a few precious moments, our shabby kitchen was filled with music and laughter, and the kind of joy that can't be bought with money we didn't have. When I tucked David down for his afternoon nap and settled Rebecca with a snack and her coloring books, I finally allowed myself to fully process what had happened to me in the darkness of the previous night. The memory was as clear and real as anything that had ever happened to me, but I understood now that it was also deeply private, a gift that would cheapen if I tried to explain it to others who hadn't lived in my particular darkness. Instead, I carried it inside me like a secret flame, warm and steady and bright enough to illuminate the path forward even when I couldn't see very far ahead. The path was still uncertain, still difficult, still marked by obstacles that would require strength I wasn't sure I possessed, but I was no longer walking it alone. That afternoon, when the school bus brought my older children home and filled the house with their stories and questions and needs, I met them with a presence I hadn't been able to offer in months. I listened to Emma's excitement about a science project, helped Jacob with math homework that had been frustrating him, admired Mary's drawing of our family where everyone was smiling under a bright yellow sun. At dinner, around our scarred wooden table with mismatched chairs and plates that had seen better days, I looked at each of my children's faces and felt overwhelmed not by the burden of caring for them, but by the privilege of loving them. They were still the same children they had been yesterday, still needy and demanding and beautifully, exhaustingly alive. But I was different, and that difference changed everything. "Mama," Emma said as we cleared the dishes together, "you seem happier today." "I am happier today," I told her, and it was the truest thing I had said in months. Sometimes we have to go through very dark times before we can appreciate the light, but the light is always there, even when we can't see it. She nodded thoughtfully, and I hoped that someday, when she faced her own dark times, she would remember this conversation and know that darkness is never permanent. That morning always comes, that love is stronger than whatever tries to defeat us. That night, as I tucked each child into bed with kisses and prayers and promises that tomorrow would be a good day, I felt the miracle of the previous night settle into my bones like marrow, becoming part of who I was, rather than just something that had happened to me. I was still Sarah Mitchell, single mother of 7, living in a house that was falling down around us, facing financial problems that wouldn't disappear overnight. But I was also Sarah Mitchell, beloved daughter of the King of Kings, carrier of grace, walker in light that no darkness could extinguish. And that made all the difference in the world. 3 months later, I stood in the same cracked bathroom, mirror, but the woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the broken soul I had seen there in November. Spring was asserting itself outside our windows, and something similar had been happening inside me. A gradual awakening, a slow but steady blooming of hope that had taken root in the darkness and grown stronger with each passing day. The yell. Reflection now showed eyes that held light again, even when they were tired. The lines around my mouth had softened from the harsh marks of constant worry into something that looked more like wisdom. My hair was clean and brushed, and I had even managed to find time for lipstick. Small things that spoke to a returning sense of self-worth, tiny victories that felt enormous after months of barely functioning. "Good morning, beautiful," I said to my reflection, and this time I meant it not because I looked perfect, but because I could see the strength that had been forged in the yell, fire of my hardest season. I could see the evidence of grace in my features, the mark of someone who had been touched by heaven and lived to tell about it. The house around me was still the same old farmhouse, still in need of repairs we couldn't quite afford yet, but it no longer felt like a prison or a symbol of our failures. It felt like home. Imperfect, but loved. Shabby, but full of the laughter and chaos and boundless energy of 7 children who were learning that their mother's joy was no longer dependent on circumstances she couldn't control. The morning routine had evolved into something that resembled a dance we had all learned together. Emma still helped with breakfast, but now she did it because she enjoyed contributing to our family team, not because she felt solely responsible for her siblings' welfare. The twins still argued, but their arguments were the normal squabbles of brothers rather than the tensions that come from living in a house where everyone is walking on eggshells around a mother who might break at any moment. "Mama, look what I drew," Mary said, holding up a picture of our family standing in front of a house that looked suspiciously like a castle, everyone wearing crowns and smiling. "We're all kings and queens because you said Jesus makes us royal." "That's exactly right, sweetheart," I said, admiring her artwork with the attention it deserved. "We might not live in a palace, but we are definitely royalty." Samuel, now wearing shoes that actually fit thanks to a successful job interview I'd had the week before at the local grocery store, was practicing tying his laces with the focused determination of a 6-year-old who had decided this was the day he would master this particular skill. "I can do it, Mama. Watch me." And I did watch, with the full attention that he deserved, marveling at his persistence and celebrating his small victory when the loops finally stayed in place. These moments had always existed, but I had been too buried in my own pain to truly see them. Now they felt like gifts, reminders of the preciousness of ordinary life lived with extraordinary love. The job at Miller's Market wasn't glamorous. I stocked shelves and ran the register for minimum wage, plus a small employee discount on groceries that made a real difference in our weekly budget. But it was steady work with a kind boss who understood about single motherhood and flexible scheduling, and it gave me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: adult interaction, and a sense of contributing to the world beyond the walls of our house. More importantly, it was a job I had been able to get because I'd found the courage to ask for help. The church pastor's wife had put in a good word for me. My sister had written a reference letter, and several members of the congregation had offered to provide childcare during my interview. The network of support that had always existed around me became visible once I stopped being too proud to see it. The bills that had once seemed insurmountable were now manageable through a combination of payment plans, assistance programs, and the steady income from my job. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we were stable in a way that felt like abundance after the terrifying uncertainty of those dark months. But the most profound changes weren't financial or practical. They were spiritual and emotional, shifts in perspective that had transformed not just how I saw my circumstances, but how I saw myself and my place in the world. I had learned to pray again, not the desperate pleading prayers of someone who feels abandoned, but the conversational prayers of someone who knows she's loved. I talk to Jesus throughout my days now, sharing my fears and celebrating my victories, asking for wisdom and expressing gratitude for the countless small blessings that surrounded me daily. Most importantly, I had learned to receive grace, both divine and human. When neighbors offered help, I accepted it without shame. When my children misbehaved, I extended forgiveness to them and to myself for not being a perfect mother. When old patterns of depression tried to reassert themselves, I fought back not with my own strength alone, but with the knowledge that I was held by love that was bigger than my pain. That evening, as I tucked Rebecca into bed, she looked at me with her serious brown eyes and asked, "Mama, do you remember when you used to cry all the time?" The question caught me off guard, and I realized with a start that I did remember, but it felt like remembering someone else's life. "Yes, baby, I remember. Mama was very sad for a while. But you're not sad anymore." "No, I'm not sad anymore. Do you know why?" "Because Jesus came to see you that night when you were crying." I stared at her in amazement. I had never told anyone about my encounter that November night, but children have their own ways of understanding the mysteries that adults struggle to explain. "How did you know about that?" "I heard you stop crying," she said simply. "And the next morning you were different, like someone had given you new batteries." I laughed at her analogy, but it wasn't far from the truth. Something had recharged in me that night, some essential part of my spirit that had been drained to empty and then filled beyond capacity with love and hope and the certainty that I was not alone in the world. "Yes," I said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Jesus did come to see me that night, and he reminded me of something very important." "What?" "That no matter how dark things get, morning always comes, and that his love is big enough to carry us through anything." She nodded with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to miracles, already incorporating this truth into her understanding of how the world works. I kissed her goodnight and turned off her light, but the glow of wonder lingered in the room. Later, after all the children were asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, I stepped out onto our front porch and looked up at the Tennessee sky scattered with stars. The air was warm with the promise of summer, full of the sounds of night creatures and the distant rumble of traffic on the highway that led to town and beyond. 6 months ago, this same porch had felt like the deck of a sinking ship, a place where I stood and wondered how much more we could take before we went under completely. Tonight, it felt like a launching pad, a place where dreams could take flight and futures could be imagined in colors brighter than I had dared to hope. I wasn't naive about the challenges that still lay ahead. Single motherhood would never be easy, And there would be more difficult days, more moments of doubt, more times when I would need to remember the lessons I had learned in my darkest hour. But I faced those future challenges with a confidence that hadn't existed before, grounded in the knowledge that I was beloved, that my children were blessed, that grace was available in unlimited supply for those brave enough to accept it. The woman who had stood before a cracked mirror and practiced fake smiles was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that authentic joy was infinitely more powerful than performed happiness. The mother who had felt crushed by the weight of 7 children's needs had discovered that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared openly and received gracefully. As I stood there under the canopy of stars, I felt a familiar presence beside me, not the dramatic manifestation of that November night, but the quiet assurance of someone who had promised never to leave or forsake me and had kept that promise in ways I was still discovering. "Thank you," I whispered into the warm night air, and the words carried with them all the gratitude of a life that had been rescued from despair and restored to purpose, for seeing me in my darkness, for touching my face when I felt untouchable, for reminding me that I am loved beyond measure. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter in response, or maybe it was just that my eyes had learned to see light again, even in the darkness. Either way, I knew with certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, I would meet it with grace and courage and the unshakable knowledge that I was not alone. Inside the house, my 7 children slept peacefully, secure in the love of a mother who had learned the difference between surviving and thriving. And somewhere in the distance, morning was already on its way, bringing with it new mercies and fresh possibilities, and the endless, inexhaustible hope that came from walking in the light of divine love. I had been broken, but I was not destroyed. I had been bent, but not broken beyond repair. I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but undaunted. And I knew that whatever valleys lay ahead, I would never walk them alone again. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.